I recently attended the 2017 AAW wood turning show in Kansas City. While there, I had the opportunity to talk to several wood turners who recommended using epoxy resin for gluing up their segmented rings for segmented wood turning. Up to this point, I've always used Titebond 2 and Titebond 3 type glues for making my segmented rings. And I have had some issues in the past where rings cracked. Even though the rings were perfect when I glued them up, I put them on a shelf for 2 or 3 months and I got small cracks between some of the joints. These other wood turners recommended the epoxy because they say it's a stronger glue. The glue contains no water, so the joints don't absorb water in your wood, and then when they dry out they would crack. So the epoxy resin eliminates this issue. So I thought I'd give it a try based on their comments. So I went and bought 2 versions of this epoxy resin. I bought these from a company called AeroMarine, and I bought 2 versions of the glue. This is a thinner glue, which is mixed 2 to 1. This is a little bit thicker version of the glue, which is mixed 1 to 1. And I thought I'd give both versions a try. So in this first part of the video, I used this first thinner resin, which I said is mixed 2 to 1. And I made some joints, which were pretty good. But after making the joints, I thought the glue might be a little bit too thin. So I decided to go to the thicker version. So I did a bunch more rings using this thicker glue, which is mixed 1 to 1. And in this video, I'll show the results of some of these joints that I put together with the epoxy resin. Now this is the epoxy I chose to use. It's made by AeroMarine. It's a 2 to 1 mix and it's fairly thin, and I pre-prepared 2 beakers here. These are disposable plastic beakers, and in the one I used 40 mils and the other I used 20 mils, and I'll mix these together. And this other plastic disposable beaker. And then we'll mix this thoroughly. As you can see, it's much thinner than the normal epoxy you might buy at Home Depot. I pre-prepared some of my blocks that I'm going to glue together. These are some 18 segments per ring blocks of alternating woods. I have a 4-inch, a 4-inch, and a 3 1/4 inch diameter disc. And I'm just using an acid brush to glue these up. And I prepared these by putting a piece of tape upside down and then attaching the wood to that so it sort of sticks together until it sets. And I did put some wax paper down here to keep the table clean, make cleanup a little bit easier. The setup time for this glue is at least half an hour, so I have a fair amount of time to do quite a few discs here. Cut the tape off. It's a little slippery. I think I used too much glue. some larger rubber bands here that I can double up and get a lot more tension on it. I do prefer using rubber bands rather than clamps because it gives you nice even pressure all around the disc. So that's glued up now. I'll just set that aside and let it dry. These are some of the segmented discs I glue with the epoxy resin. When I take the rubber bands off, the rubber bands are pretty much destroyed, so I can't reuse the rubber bands like I did with the Titebond glue. And there's a little bit of a sheen from the glue. So after I take that and I sand it on my disc sander, it looks much like this. So these have all been sanded. This next set of rings, I'm going to do something a little bit differently. These are 18 segments per ring with spacers in between. So I actually have a total of 36 pieces of wood in each of these rings. So what I've done, I've mixed up some epoxy. And the way I've been doing is I have these disposable plastic beakers and they're graduated. So I poured 15 milliliters of the thick epoxy resin in this beaker, and then 15 mils of the other resin in this beaker. So this is my hardener, which is much thicker. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be, since they're exactly the same volume, pouring the thinner resin into the hardener, which is thicker. And my total volume when I'm done should be 30 mils. And I just scrape it out of this beaker to make sure I get the full amount, so I have a good even mix of the two. And then mix this thoroughly. So I'm not going to use the tape to glue these rings. I'm just going to paste up one segment at a time, assemble, and then put them together with rubber bands. because this glue is like an hour setup time, I can move these pieces. Unlike Titebond, they would have set by now, I won't be able to move them. So this is an advantage of using the epoxy. And that should be it. And these rubber bands do get destroyed. They're full of epoxy glue, so they will get cut off and destroyed, so you can't reuse the rubber bands. But that's all it's stated, and it works out pretty good. I think what I can do is I can probably just put glue on the larger segments, and the other bands probably don't need to put glue on. So I'm going to try that with the next one. That should cut the setup time in half. After allowing the segmented rings to harden overnight, this is the results we get on our 36 segment rings. I'll eventually take off these rubber bands. Rubber bands are pretty much destroyed. They're actually glued on there, so I'll take those off and scrape them off, and even use a wire wheel to get the residue of the rubber bands off. And then I'll sand this surface flush on my disc sander, and then we'll take a look at the finished results. After removing the rubber bands, sanding these discs on my edge sander, cleaning up the edges on a wire wheel, and then sanding them some more, this is our resulting segmented ring. Got nice tight joints, and it should hold up pretty well. Here's the second one, and then there's two of these going to a center point, perfect center on these. All glue with a thicker epoxy resin. These are all segmented rings. The segments were cut utilizing the Accu-Wedge system on the Accu-Slice table, and then they are glued using the epoxy cement. And I will admit I was a little skeptical initially with the epoxy cement. I thought it'd be difficult to use, a lot sloppier, but in reality I'm quite impressed with the results. The glue does have a longer setup time, so you have really almost an hour setup time. So you have a lot of time to play with your pieces before they actually set. So if they move a little bit, you can readjust it to accommodate any movement of your wood. So I've done everything here from 6 segments per ring, 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick. Some thicker, inch and a half thick segments with 8, even up to 18 segments per ring. And even some 18 segments around 3/4 inch thick. And then some of these multi-layered laminate strips I glued together to make pieces for the bottom of bowls. In general, I'm quite happy with the results I received using the epoxy resin for gluing up my segmented rings. I tried both the thin epoxy resin and the thicker. I'm going to make the thicker resin my standard going forward. I think the thicker resin works a little bit better. So that'll be our standard resin going forward. These are just some of the mini discs I made using the epoxy resin. A few of these were made with a thinner resin, but most of these were made with a thicker resin. In general, I'm quite happy. I'll be putting some of these on the shelf, letting them set for a couple of months, making sure that no cracks occur. But we'll let you know how that turns out if we do develop any cracks, but I don't expect there will be. In mixing this epoxy resin, I've been using these small disposable plastic beakers. These are 50 milliliter beakers, and I can accurately measure as little as 10 milliliters in these, mix them together, get my epoxy resin mixed thoroughly, and then when they're done I throw these beakers away. They're fairly inexpensive. I think a box of 100 of these was like $20. So in conclusion, I'm quite happy with the epoxy resin. I'll be making a lot more rings and segmented bowls going forward in the future using the epoxy resin. There's one video following this series in which I took one of my segmented rings, I cut it into mini layers, I think about 75 thousandths of an inch thick, made a tornado pattern bowl, and that video will be following shortly.